Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. And I want to welcome everyone to this discussion of the Chinese Communist Party at 100. Is the past prologue to the future? My name is Carl Gershman, and I'm the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is hosting this meeting. And I'm very excited that we've gathered together here scholars, some of the leading scholars in the world on China, to talk about a subject which is of profound importance to the future of democracy, not only in China, but really in the entire world. Larry Diamond will moderate this discussion. I think, as everyone knows, Larry is a global scholar of democracy, but he's been spending an increasing amount of attention on China because of its importance to the future of democracy. And the four scholars that we brought together today are among the leading scholars on China in the whole world. And they are Perry Link, who is a professor at the University of California at Riverside and an emeritus professor at Princeton University; Minjin Pei, who's a professor at Claremont McKenna College; Elizabeth Economy, who with Larry is a senior fellow now at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University; and Andy Nathan, who's a professor at Columbia University. And Andy is also a former member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, and Minjin is a current member of the NED board. And all four of these scholars have published articles in recent weeks and days analyzing the Communist Party of China and the future of China, issues that they'll be talking about right now in this meeting. And I think it's fair to say that whatever differences they might have, they all agree that the immense and highly centralized power of Xi Jinping is not as stable and as permanent as it sometimes appears, and of course as he would like it to seem. Of course, we don't know if China will ever become, as Liu Xiaobo said in the closing statement at his trial, if China will ever become a nation of laws where human rights are paramount. But as we have our discussion today, it is my hope that we'll keep his memory and his vision in our thoughts and prayers. Thank you very much, and I want to turn the floor over to Larry Diamond. Larry, you got to unmute.
Thank you, Carl. I want to join in welcoming our audience. It's my honor to moderate this panel reflecting on the past and future of the Chinese Communist Party on the eve of this historic occasion, what is recognized as the 100th anniversary of the CCP's founding. I want to begin by articulating some of the questions we're going to be exploring in this panel, and then I'll introduce a little bit more in detail the four distinguished speakers in the order that they'll be making their opening remarks. First, how should we characterize the current CCP regime? Looking back, how does it compare with some previous Chinese regimes and with other dictatorships in recent world history? And crucially, what's been the impact of Xi Jinping's nearly decade-long tenure as party and state leader? Why has the CCP been able to sustain its rule for so long, a period of time now surpassing the lifespan of the Soviet Union? And what are the prospects for the CCP regime as China enters a post-industrial era with high levels of income, education, and information? Is the Chinese Communist Party essentially giving the Chinese people what they want, economic prosperity? Or is the presumption of broad Chinese public support for CCP rule an illusion or a fleeting reality that will erode with continued modernization? To answer and debate these and related questions, we have the four distinguished scholars that you see on your screen and that Carl mentioned. Perry Link has taught modern Chinese language and literature for 23 years at Princeton, for 8 years at UCLA, and for 9 years now at UC Riverside, where he's currently Chancellorial Chair for Teaching Across Disciplines. He's written widely on Chinese language, literature, popular culture, and intellectual history, and has also, promoted and explored the work of courageous Chinese thinkers, writers, and activists, including Lu Binyan, Fang Lizhi, and as Carl mentioned, Liu Xiaobo. His most famous article, perhaps, The Anaconda and the Chandelier, discusses how the Chinese Communist regime uses intimidation to induce self-censorship and would-be critics. Minxin Pei is the Tom and Margot Pritzker 72 Professor and Chair of the Department of Government at Claremont McKenna College. He's also a non-resident senior fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the US. We're proud to say that he's also editor of the China Leadership Monitor, sponsored by the Hoover Institution, and author of many influential books and articles on communist rule in China, including China's Trapped Transition and China's Crony Capitalism. He's now writing a book on China's surveillance state. Elizabeth Economy is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her forthcoming book, The World According to China, explores China's foreign policy ambitions and their impact on the international system. Her most recent widely discussed book, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, was shortlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize, a prestigious literary award for foreign affairs books. And last but certainly not least is Andy Nathan, class of 1919, professor of political science at Columbia University. His teaching and research interests include Chinese politics and foreign policy, and the comparative study of political participation, political culture, and human rights. Professor Nathan's books include Chinese Democracy, the Tiananmen Papers, which he co-edited with Perry Link, and China's Search for Security. He is also co-editor of How East Asians View Democracy and a member of the steering committee of the Asian Barometer. So I'm going to call on them to make some opening remarks in the order I introduced them. And Perry, you now have the
Thank you very much. I'm sure I speak for everyone here in thanking Carl and Larry and the NED for organizing this event. But to keep within 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to go quickly to the points I'd like to raise and then hear everybody's view on. I'm going to raise two perspectives that go far outside of the 100 years of the history of the CCP to look at more than 2,000 years of Chinese history and place it in that context. There are three, you might say, short-lived violent government paroxysms in Chinese history. The Qin in the 3rd century BC, the late Sui in the early 7th century AD, and the Communist dynasty in the 20th century and extending until now. I need to oversimplify in order to make this comparison, but you'll see why in a moment, I hope. These three have, and of course there was autocracy and repression in other dynasties as well, I don't mean that. But these three have a number of features in common. They made strong centralized states, used what we call the Fajia, the legalist philosophy to run them, built heavy-handed bureaucracies, and used violent enforcement of control, built unusually large armies, did so by drafting soldiers and by drafting labor, corvée labor, to do things, including what we would call infrastructure, like building the Great Wall. The Great Wall was built in the Qin and majorly rebuilt in the late Sui. Standardized the Chinese writing system in the in the Qin and in the Communist period, launching campaigns against non-Han Central Asian neighbors, the Xiongnu in the earlier dynasties, and as we know, the Uyghurs and Kazakhs today for the CCP. Both the Sui and the Communists invaded Korea, both by legend and primarily by fact. In fact, all three of them, Fen Shu Keng Ru, burned books and killed scholars. Now I'm going to repeat, of course, these parallels are not perfect, but they're good enough for my purposes and for our discussion, I think, to raise my point, which is that all of the Qin and the Sui were both short-lived. The underlying strength of Chinese civilization outlived both of them, both of these violent paroxysms, and may well survive the CCP paroxysm as well. I need to add one major caveat to that I know Minxin would add if I don't, that's different about the CCP situation, and that's the accessibility of Orwellian technology, sky cameras, facial recognition, DNA banks, and the like. But I still want to entertain the notion that the ethical foundations of Chinese civilization underneath remain strong. I don't want to go into examples now because time is short, but in discussion, if you'd like to, I will. And I think the CCP dynasty is going to be outlived by Chinese civilization. The second major angle I'd like to present is that I don't see the CCP movement in the Marxist-Leninist tradition as much as I do in the traditions of Chinese peasant rebellions. And here too, I'm going to take some examples just for the sake of argument in order to sketch my point. There's a recurrent theme in Chinese history of millenarian peasant rebellions. Prominent examples in the last 1,000 years have been the Red Turbans, the Hongjin in the Yuan dynasty, 14th century, the White Lotus Rebellion at the end of the 18th century, the Taipings in the middle of the 19th, and the Communists in the 20th, and lasting until now. All of these movements had the following: a charismatic leader, Guo Zixing in the case of the Red Turbans, Hong Xiuquan in the case of the Taipings, Mao Zedong in the case of the Communists, all preached equality, brotherhood, but in fact set up systems that were strictly hierarchical and secretive and ruled from the top down. All were millenarian in the sense that they promised that their movements aimed at an ideal society, a heaven on earth. All four had touted magical sorts of ideologies that would help them reach this millenarian end. And the doctrines of the ideologies were recorded in books, Tianshu, heavenly texts, that were the secret to how to do it. Now here it's really worth noting, I want to stress this point, all of the millenarian ideologies in these examples I've given you were borrowed from outside China. For the Red Turbans and the White Lotus, it was Maitreya Buddhism, which originated, of course, in India. For the Taipings, it was an odd form of Christianity in which the great leader Hong Xiuquan offered himself as the younger brother of Jesus Christ. For the Communists, it was the Western gurus named Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. And in all these cases, the importance of the foreign texts was not, I feel, their intellectual contact so much as the panache they offered, the stylishness, the addition to the charisma of the great leader. In the followers, I think there was a psychology like, 原来和尚好念经. Monks from afar are the best ones at reading the sutras. And this, of course, added to the mysterious charisma of the great leaders. In short, I see Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist movement much more in this tradition of peasant rebellion ideology than I do in the tradition of modern Marxist thought. For us today to think of Mao as a great Marxist thinker in the Marx-Engels-Lenin line is somewhat of a joke, in my view, that reveals, among other things, our own preoccupation with Western thought. For Mao, Marxism was his banner, not his brain. I'm going to push this one step further within the 8 minutes. Maybe I still have 1 or 2 left. And would like to raise the question of why the CCP cracked down so hard on Yiguandao and Falun Gong, which are much more in the mode of these pre-modern millenarian movements. In a sense, I think they're seeing themselves in a mirror. These guys are indigenous as we are, and they might be hard to handle. Foreigners, after all, can be tricked and cheated and manipulated, and we've seen plenty of examples of that. But the prisons in China, beginning in the 1950s and right down to today, are disproportionately filled with these millenarian rebellion types. Now, Larry, how much more time do I have?
About a minute or two.
All right. There are two other points that I'll just touch on in the minute or two, but won't go into. One is that I see the confrontation of the communist movement and modernization as a major problem. And I feel that from the mid-19th century, when Chinese political and intellectuals leaders woke up to the fact that we have to catch up, there was a tremendous pressure to catch up. And what the authoritarians in the communist movement tried to do is jump there fast, take shortcuts. And so we had the Great Leap Forward, which was Chao Ying Gan Mei, pass England and catch up with America fast. The Cultural Revolution, get to the ideal human being fast. I think the one-child policy is a sort of a illustration of that too. How do we slim ourselves down and get somewhere fast? And I would argue that Xi Jinping's radical misuse of nationalism is a sort of what we see today in the papers reminds me of the Cultural Revolution's onset, this great nationalist surge to get somewhere. The other last point I'd like to raise, and this can be for discussion, is that maybe all of us on this panel and maybe most of the listeners are going to be negative about the communist movement, and that's fine, but it did some good. Getting rid of schistosomiasis and spreading literacy. And I think it's important for us to recognize that a lot of the followers of the communist movement, here I'm thinking about our friends Liu Binian, Fang Lizhi, Zhi Zhongyun, Li Shenzhi, all the editors of the Yanhuang Chunqiu magazine, that idealistically threw themselves into this movement in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and of course got battered later, but meant well and did some good. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Perry, thank you for starting off the program with a historical perspective, and now we'll go to Min-Shin Pei.
Okay, thank you, Larry, and I'm very pleased to be here today. The first point I want to make is to underscore a historical fact that the Communist Party would like us to forget, and certainly a point they're not going to refer to when they celebrate the party's centennial today, actually in Beijing. That is, the Communist Party is an accident of history. That is, there was one event, had that not occurred, there would be no party. The Communist Party would have been a footnote in Chinese history, and that is the Japanese invasion of China, 1937. The Communist Party was on the verge of being completely destroyed by the Kuomintang in 1936. So totally surrounded. It was down to 30,000 soldiers. And then the Japanese invaded. And that changed the course of Chinese history. I think, so before we look into what the Communist Party has done for itself, done for China, let's keep that in perspective. So when the party says the Chinese people or the history picked Communist Party, I think the Chinese people certainly did not have a say in this, but that historical accident certainly had a profound impact. But let's look at what the party has done since it seized power. It is probably the most consequential political regime in Chinese history. The party has really transformed China totally from top to bottom in so many ways. First, it has consolidated and extended the reach of the state in a way no previous Chinese regime, traditional or modern, in the case of the Kuomintang, ever did. Traditional Chinese state had relatively shallow reach into Chinese society, did not really reach down to villages. And its bureaucracy was small. The government resources were very limited. But the Chinese Communist Party, in the first really 10 years in power, completely transformed the Chinese state. It is so well organized in so many ways. And second, it consolidated the Chinese empire. If you look at the Qing Dynasty, which arguably had the biggest empire, its control of Tibet and Xinjiang was very, very superficial. Not under the Communist Party. The Communist Party now has complete control of these peripheral areas. So that is the first transformation the Chinese Communist Party has done. And second, the Chinese Communist Party has built a very powerful, strong state. That is, it has built a top-down system based on the Communist Party itself. It's a party is a very unique political system. It is capable of mobilizing the kind of material and human resources no previous Chinese government could even dream of. The Qing Dynasty, at its zenith, could only raise something like 4% of GDP as tax revenue. Today, if you look at the aggregate tax revenue as raised by the Chinese state, it's almost approaching 40%. So we're talking about several orders of magnitude difference. And also, as Perry just mentioned, this is a regime has eliminated all organized forms of potential resistance, from secret societies to religion to civil society to private institutions. And that's, again, no other previous regimes, however brutal or despotic, were able to do. And this is a system, finally, the point I want to make is this is a system that is uniquely suited to mobilizing resources for catch-up industrialization. So when we marvel at China's speed of economic development, we should keep in mind that this is almost a system custom-made for forced industrialization, the same kind of system that enabled Stalin's Russia to industrialize. But the same system has left deep scars, really a very traumatic legacy for Chinese society. It is by far the most brutal, bloody regime in Chinese history. In peacetime, this regime has probably has been responsible for more deaths than any other regime in Chinese history. If you look at the number of people killed in the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries in the early 1950s, the land reform campaign, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and many other political campaigns. I'm not even counting the people who died, who were starved to death during the Great Leap Forward. The number is approaching 10 million. So we are talking about during the Mao 27 years in power, more than 300,000 people on average died of political violence every year. So that is a very bloody legacy. Emotionally, it has also inflicted enormous trauma, psychological trauma on Chinese people. If you talk to Chinese people, my generation or the earlier generation really don't want to talk about the Cultural Revolution. They don't want to talk about past, because it's really bitter, painful, traumatic to think about those sufferings. So the scars remain. So right after Cultural Revolution, there was this period in which the most popular moving literature genre was so-called the scar literature. That is a genre that reflected or tried to recall the traumas in the Mao era. And some of the best movies produced since the end of the Mao era was about that trauma. This also, I think, another legacy is really the big lie that is today, the history that this system has really been very successful in erasing, distorting historical memory. People, ordinary people in China really don't have a clue about historical truths, what the country really was like because if you look at the history books, basically, about the sanctioned history books, basically Chinese history began with the Communist Party. And what happened before really did not count. So that is another one. And one of its legacies. And it destroys trust in Chinese society. The use of informers, encouraging family members to turn on each other. You really don't find those things in traditional Chinese society or even under the Kuomintang. And lastly, I want to say that it has corrupted Chinese language. If you look at the state of Chinese language today, the party terminology that has now penetrated or colonized Chinese language has turned Chinese language into a very, very strange kind of language. I want to end on this note, that is, what about the future of the party? The party is its own worst enemy. When you look at what has actually destroyed the party, it's not some outside forces. It's all the party itself. The Achilles heel of the Chinese Communist Party is that it has absolutely no defense mechanism against a strong man that can dominate the party, terrorize the party, and impose its will on the party, and ultimately destroy the party. I think we are now probably at this moment. Thank you.
Wonderful. We'll definitely come back to that in the discussion, Min-Shen. But now we'll turn to Liz Economy.
Thanks so much, Larry, and thanks to both you and Carl for inviting me. It's great to be here as part of a panel with Andy and Min-Shen and Perry. So I don't think I'm going to be able to top that provocative ending from Min-Shen, and I'm really looking forward to some further discussion on it. But it occurred to me as I've been, thinking about this 100th anniversary of the CCP. At some level, it's really just about legitimacy, and the legitimacy of Xi Jinping and his vision and his right to govern, and the legitimacy of the CCP and its right to rule the people. And in many respects, legitimacy is the Achilles heel of the Communist Party. It's a very small and exclusive party, self-selected, that represents only 6.5% of the population, roughly 91 or 92 million people out of a country of roughly 1.4 billion people, with no direct accountability to the Chinese people. And yet these people, this party, holds virtually all of the most important jobs in the Chinese government, and 60% of civil service jobs. And by civil service, doesn't mean just what we consider to be civil service in the United States, but it also includes things like the heads of hospitals or universities, or certainly state-owned enterprises. So I guess there's always a question that dogs the Communist Party about its right to govern. And I think when Xi Jinping first came to power in November of 2012 as General Secretary of the Communist Party, the party was really facing a legitimacy crisis. It was endemically corrupt. It was little more than a stepping stone to personal, political, and economic advancement. And there was no core ideology around which party members could cohere. In 2010, there were reported 180,000 protests, mostly due to one form of corruption or another, whether it was about illegal land grabs or something to do with environmental protection. So Xi Jinping walked into this situation, and yes, there was pride around the Olympics, certainly around the fact that China managed through the global financial crisis reasonably well. But none of that really redounded that directly to the Communist Party itself. And certainly no one at the time would talk about the Communist Party or China as a model that other countries, should emulate the way that Xi has suggested. And I think Xi brought a vision to his leadership that has been very important. His great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which was really about having a robust Chinese Communist Party at the forefront of the political system, a People's Liberation Army that he said, could fight and win wars, about being an innovation power, as on par with the United States and Germany and Japan. Make China middle income country and then a rich country. and also reclaiming centrality for China on the global stage. And I think, there was also a kind of formula that he brought, which was really, I would say, 2 parts legitimacy and 1 part brute force. And the 1 part of legitimacy, I think, is performative legitimacy. Is the party delivering, for the people, for their daily needs? Are you better off today than you were 5 years ago? And he can say, you can doubt the claims, but he's met his 2 centenary goals of doubling per capita income and eliminating absolute poverty. He also has his anti-corruption campaign that I certainly don't believe has actually gotten to the roots of corruption in China, and Minxin is probably the world expert on this topic, but it has netted close to 3 million officials, so it is consequential and appealing to many people in China. So there has been some, I think, improvement probably in the sense of the party's performative legitimacy. And I think there's a second kind of legitimacy that's really about making the Chinese people feel as though they're part of a collective enterprise that the party is leading. And I think the best example of this is probably just how well the party did in the early stages of the pandemic, and quarantining 1 million people and building the hospitals and getting ramping up on the PPE and basically containing the spread of the virus in ways that were not really matched by any large economy. There's also a defensive nationalism that she has not introduced. It's been there for a long time, but certainly has used to his advantage. And we've seen that come into play, in many instances. But, when Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," and then, the attack on Australia over its call for investigation into the COVID-19, and then most recently, the attack on H&M for its raising its concerns about sourcing cotton from Xinjiang and the issue of forced labor. That produced an enormous amount of vitriol on the Chinese internet, right? Really stirred up, populist national sentiment, and of course had very serious economic consequences for all those actors as well. And then the brute force part was basically, Xi Jinping amassing, enormous amount of power into his own hands, and reasserting the Communist Party into Chinese society, the surveillance state, social credit system, all the mechanisms of political and economic control. I think the result has been a China that's both more repressive and authoritarian at home, expansive and ambitious abroad, but also one that is viewed by at least some in China as relatively successful. And there's a lot of triumphalist rhetoric right now emanating from the party. The East is rising and the West is declining. But I would argue that Xi's policies have also unleashed a set of political dynamics that could derail his ambitions and ultimately undermine his rule. And I'll just try to go quickly through these, and you cut me off if I start to go too long, okay? But I think on the domestic front, he's really created a China that is as polarized and as fractured as the Chinese leadership now, says the United States is. He's disenfranchised very significant sectors of Chinese society. And I'd point to women right at the top. Women are very poorly represented in the upper echelons, for example, of the Chinese Communist Party. There's only 1 among the top 25 and 4%, among the top, 200 odd members of the Central Committee. So it's, not very good. In the World Economic Forum's gender parity ranking that they do every year, it's really fascinating. From the first year of Xi Jinping's rule in 2013 to today, the access of Chinese women to health, the economy, the political system, and the educational system has fallen from 69th to 107th out of 144 countries. It's really astonishing. Clearly, when we're looking at the periphery of China, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, probably to a lesser extent Inner Mongolia, China has placed these regions. It's like living under a siege. They're living in a siege mentality. And the budget for internal security during Xi Jinping's time has almost tripled. So I think that demonstrates that the party has not been terribly effective at engaging these populations in really constructive ways. I also think that Xi Jinping has caused what I call a collective depression of the creative class, and for scholars and entrepreneurs whose currency is really pushing the boundaries and freedom of expression, coloring outside the lines. The world of Xi Jinping is an extremely difficult and depressing one. And you can look at what happened with Jack Ma just as an example, not just about his speech, in November, criticizing the regulatory regime, and then what happened when they pulled the IPO of Ant Financial, but the fact that they went after his university, right, because they believed that he was creating potentially, a group or a clique that could challenge the Communist Party, with their different kinds of ideas. And then finally, I think what we're also seeing in China, this is something that Scott Rozelle at Stanford has talked a lot about, is in some respects the creation of an almost permanent underclass. And so despite the fact that Xi has said, yes, we've eliminated absolute poverty, and there's some doubt about that, but let's just say it's true. Li Keqiang, also came out and said that 600 million Chinese are living on $140 a month, or less, or on average $140 per month. And Scott's work shows that rural Chinese, as of 2015, only 40% of them graduated from high school. They have very unequal access to quality education, and they're not really being prepared for the jobs of the 21st century. So I think all of these things have implications for China's demographics, their consumption, the ability of China to grow their GDP over the long term, brain drain, the ability of China to access, high quality foreign talent, and also just the opportunity for the leadership to receive good policy advice. And then very quickly, and I'll finish with this, I think also the international backlash that we see is a direct result of both the sort of repressive domestic policies that the party has pursued, as well as its coercive and ambitious foreign policies. If you look across right now global polls that talk about trust in Xi Jinping and the desire to have China lead on the global stage, they are at an all-time low. And it's not just the United States and Japan, it's countries like Cambodia, right, which we often think of as close to client states of China. So, there's clearly really serious reputational damage that the party has done. And that's to tick off a few others. I think, the European Union has put the comprehensive agreement on investment on ice because of the whole Xinjiang situation. That was 7 years in the making. India has become a much more robust participant in the Quad. The EU and Asia together are establishing new partnerships dealing with Asia-Pacific security. Taiwan has been elevated on the agenda of many countries now. It's not just about the United States. So I think all of these things are sort of shaping new kinds of challenges for Xi and the party. And I guess I'll just stop there, but just maybe end by saying, to some extent, it seems that Xi Jinping's, success, right, the greater his success in this regard, perhaps the greater the chance of his ultimate demise. Thanks.
Wow. Wonderful. Wonderful, your analysis. And now we go to Andy Nathan.
All right. Thank you, Larry. So over the weekend, I published an article in the Wall Street Journal weekend section called An Anxious 100th Birthday for China's Communist Party. And the next thing you know, on the 28th, 2 days ago, the Global Times, which is, the People's Daily's polemical arm, published an editorial called U.S. Belittling China, CPC, a self-emboldening move. And they quote the title of my Wall Street Journal article without mentioning me. I'm sorry about that. The Global Times says these Westerners who are denouncing China or denouncing the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, they said the anniversary is an anxious 100th birthday. So that's a quote of the headline that I didn't write. The Wall Street Journal wrote it, but it's a reference to my article. And they end their editorial by assuring us that the Chinese people have united firmly around the Chinese Communist Party, and the they no longer worship the United States. Well, actually, I think the Global Times has a point about the legitimacy, which Liz has raised, of the Chinese Communist Party at the present time. Larry mentioned that I'm on the steering committee of the Asian Barometer survey, which Larry is also on. And the Asian Barometer survey has carried out 5 waves of surveys in China, as well as doing surveys in other countries. And we have consistently found that public support for the regime in China is quite strong, measured in various ways, in trust in institutions or in pride in endorsement that the government in Beijing is good for our country, and so on and so forth. And it's not only the Asian Barometer survey, but other surveys. For example, the Harvard Ash Center has done a series of surveys on trust in various levels of government. And many other scholars who've carried out surveys in China have found that the level of public support for the regime is quite strong. The reasons for that are many, and some of them have been mentioned by Liz, and some of them are very well known. One reason is that the regime quite effectively controls information. People don't really know what's going on, for example, in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong, or they don't know about the June 4th, 1989 event. A second reason why high public support is there is that the regime has, as Liz mentioned, has performed quite well. Performance, economic growth, control of COVID-19, exertion of Chinese influence in the international system, provision of, even though it's not quite adequate, but better than before, social welfare provisions, better urban parks, better retirement systems for urban residents, and so on and so forth. People are pretty happy when they compare their parents' lives or the life that they themselves came from with what they're getting recently. And although there are many problems in the economy, so far the government has managed to keep things spinning. Another obvious reason is repression, that although Liz mentioned that there are a lot of different sectors of the population with various reasons to be dissatisfied, but most people understand that if they go up against the regime, they're going to get in trouble very quickly. And a lot of people who, the intellectuals and the middle class and the property owners and the entrepreneurs, are kind of afraid of what would happen if the CCP fell. They're afraid not only of the CCP, but also of chaos that they think would follow. And the fact that chaos would follow the fall of the CCP is something that the CCP has created, because there's no organized opposition to take over if they were to lose. So these are all well-known reasons. I think there's some somewhat less well-known reasons why public support for the Chinese Communist Party has been quite high. One is something that we do explore in the Asian Barometer survey, which is political culture. Although the political culture is changing, but there's still many, many people, especially less educated people, rural people, older people, who have rather traditional deferential attitudes. They believe that the government should take control of everything. They believe that it is the job of the citizen to defer and not to pursue individual interests at the sacrifice of collective interests. They don't want to. They just don't think it's right to tangle with the government, and the regime's propaganda that we know what we're doing and we're more moral and we're providing examples of leadership fit into some certain traditional Chinese beliefs. When it comes to the expectation of people for the government, they're interested in honest government and equity and provision of services and things like that. A second, less obvious reason for public support for the government is the fact that this government, although it is a very large, sophisticated administrative apparatus, as Min-Chin said, and has a vast repressive apparatus, it's also very, very imbricated with the population. There's a lot of negotiation and back and forth between local government and the population. Entrepreneurs will run for office in the People's Congress system so they can rub elbows with officials. If there are demonstrations over land seizures, the local government is likely to mobilize influentials to go and talk to the people who are demonstrating. There are systems of there are electronic reporting systems for local government where citizens can bring up complaints that they have and oftentimes get some kind of a result. Rural officials tend to work through local kinship and networks. Jennifer Pon of Stanford has an interesting book about how local officials will use poverty benefits, relief benefits, to particularly sort of buy off people who are discontented locally and also keep an eye on those people. And I think a third non-obvious reason for strong regime support is what you might call Chinese identity. As China has come under the kind of attack that everybody is talking about, such as Liz has mentioned, of foreign attack and so forth, I think many Chinese people feel that their civilization and their national interest is not understood and that the world is prejudiced against China. And, you know, I may not be satisfied with everything in China, but I'm still proud of being a Chinese person. I don't like to be looked down on, kind of an attitude, which I think is, you know, we as Americans can, or people from any country can really appreciate. So I think regime support is strong now, but I argued in the Wall Street Journal article, and I've argued in the pages of the Journal of Democracy, which Larry co-edited until recently, that as China moves toward its ambition of being richer and more technically advanced, or to what's called the second centenary goal, that is to say, on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, that 100th anniversary will come in 2049. Xi Jinping has said at that time, we want to be a modernized socialist country. As they move in that direction, they build up a population that's more sophisticated, more educated, more urban, and whose values, according to the Asian Barometer survey, are different from the values of the older, rural, and less educated population. This new middle class, if you will, which is still a minority in the country, as it gets bigger and as the older generations disappear, this new population of China is going to be less amenable to the kind of kindergarten government, if you could call it, as Hu Shi called it, in fact, back in the 19-teens, where the government says, we know everything and you know nothing and you should defer to us. This is a population that is more open to the outside world, more individualistic, has a different understanding of the role of government from the old population. But I don't think that this change that I'm talking about is going to come anytime soon. So I'm zigzagging. I know that this frustrates Carl Gershman because I always do this. I think that the regime is very strong and the population supports it. I think that eventually this is going to change, but I do think that for the foreseeable future, the population support for the regime is quite strong, and the regime is incredibly strong, and anybody who goes up against it is going to get whooped, and there's no organized opposition. So I wouldn't look for short-term change. In this respect, I guess I disagree with Min Shin. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Let me just say, Andy, I've been looking at the 5 waves of our Asian Barometer data from China, and it is indeed very interesting to see that on most of the items, including the ones, of course, that you've been examining on traditional versus modern values toward authority and so on, young people do tend to, you know, embrace more modern values. And on some of those, you know, China is not that different than, you know, some East Asian countries like, say, Singapore or something. Not that Singapore is a democracy, but there seems to be, in the most recent survey, a little bit of a movement back among young people, which leads one to wonder if, you know, this extreme ideological push of the party under Xi may be having some impact on attenuating that. Let me carry the discussion forward now among the four of you by posing two questions. I'll you know, start in the order in which each of you spoke initially, and then we'll rotate things. I'd like to, and I'll make reference to each of them by citing the essay that we just published at the Hoover Institution by another very brave dissident now recently emerged, a former professor at the Central Party School in Beijing named Tsai Xia, who argues in her essay now that just went up on the Hoover website that the CCP regime has deteriorated into a neo-totalitarian regime. So my first question to you is this a useful or correct way to characterize CCP rule today in China? On the one hand, you know, if you're a middle-class person in Shanghai who's not kind of politically oriented or is just going to complain on one of those websites about a pothole not being fixed, you may not feel it very much, but, you know, maybe if you've been abroad and seen what the rest of the world looks like, or know you're being lied to or something, you're kind of seething in a way that maybe even might not be registered in our Asian Barometer surveys. So first, how should we think about the regime today? And second of all, I'll push the debate about where things are headed. She, Tsai Xia, depicts the CCP as what she calls a paper tiger that looks powerful from the outside, but is fragile structurally because of a number of issues that many of you have highlighted, and some others that I'll just kind of cite from her paper. Mounting debt, which is, you know, if you look at the total debt stock in relation to GDP, is gotten to be, you know, really, really high. Persistent corruption, which Minchin has written about, the deepening inequalities, which I think have accelerated dramatically in the last decade, and Xi's own continuous purges and concentration of power, which is one of the things Liz wrote about in her last book. And Tsai contends that this has brought about extreme dissatisfaction among middle and high-level officials of the CCP, which we are not seeing. So how do we characterize the CCP regime today? And, you know, what are we missing, or what should we just accept about the security of its rule now? So Parry, back to you to respond any way you want to either or both of those questions. You're muted, Parry. Unmute.
Okay, Larry's raised a cornucopia of questions. I was on a panel with Tsai Xia about a week ago when this very question of how deep is the support of the regime among the bureaucrats came up. And somebody tried to pin her down by saying, what percent? And she thought for a moment and said, about 60 to 80% are hollow inside. That is, maybe not as disaffected as she is, but have different layers of their psychology. That strikes me as plausible. None of us can of course see into people's inner lives, but Chinese people's brains have levels, and they have levels of responding. And this is where I'd like to ask maybe Andy and Larry, who work on the Asia Barometer, how do you know which level of the moral response you're getting at when you hear what somebody says? They might be saying what they fear they have to say, or what it's pointless not to say, because it's like accepting the weather. This is the way things are. Andy referred to the older generation as thinking, well, the government's supposed to be that way, and so that's what we will do. And so let me try to put it this way. The question we need to ask, I think, is not what do you say about your support of the government, but what would you say if you were free of if you had good information and if you were free of this, what I call fossilized fear that everybody just gets used to. So that's it, Larry. I'm
Okay.
going to cop out of asking your question just because it's too hard, but I do think there are many, many levels and we don't see them on the surface. And I think
I'm going to
Taisha's
go.
got a better chance of seeing them than we do.
So let me go straight to Andy to answer the challenge that you posed, which is not the first time he's heard such a challenge in talking about the Chinese data from our Asian barometer. So Andy, go ahead.
Well, survey research is always very limited in its ability to get into those subtleties because you can only ask whatever question you ask and count the answers that you get. Larry, you mentioned a possible decline from wave 4 to 5 in youth attitude, but that's the error. That can very well be the error term. I mean, these things just fluctuate. I mean, all survey researchers know that a lot of people don't have an opinion and they'll just give you a top of the head opinion. Other people lie, and so forth. So there's a giant error term. So when we run the statistics, if we get what's called an R squared in a regression of about 0.3, then, which means we've explained 30% of the variance, we're very excited. We've got something, but the rest is all error. It's not only Chinese people who have a lot of layers, right? Everybody has a lot of layers, including my old friend Perry has layers. You guys don't even know what they are, and even Perry doesn't know. So there's really, Freud would, but so for example, there's a scholar named Jan Elster, who's a colleague in my department, who's developed an interesting theory called adaptive preference formation. People really do prefer. His example is sour grapes. The fox said, "I didn't want the grapes." The fox is not lying. He didn't want the grapes, but he originally wanted them, but he formed a new preference. Chinese people may form a preference, as you said, Perry, you're right. I mean, they form that preference because they don't have the information, they don't have the alternative, so they prefer what they have. But what can break that down? Is that very deep or is it very superficial? So I do think that if some of the problems that Liz mentioned all came together, the debt, the demography, the water, the climate change, fighting a war in Taiwan and losing it, and so forth, if it all happened at once, people's preferences might shift. However, the Chinese Communist Party understands that better than I do. And I think they're doing everything they can to make sure that such a concatenation of disasters doesn't occur.
Okay, let me come to mention now and highlight two questions among the broad questions, but you can answer and respond to anything you want. One is about the party and state officials, the 60 to 80% who might have some level of disaffection, as Perry conveyed what Said had said. Does that strike you as at all plausible that that the percentage with some level of disaffection could be that high? And if so, what are the implications of that? And more broadly, are we looking at, preference adaptation, as Andy put it, borrowing Jan Elster, or are we looking at, as in the Eastern European situation, some significant degree of preference falsification?
Okay. I want to say the party does not know how many of its own 92 million party members are actually loyal. And the party probably doesn't want to find out. The party is very worried because you only find out whether they are loyal or not when they are tested. And here I would like to recommend all of you to watched videos of June 4th, of the Tiananmen demonstrations. What is striking is that a lot of participants were party members. What's good about Chinese demonstrators is that they would put their units, their government affiliation on this big banner. So you would say Xinhua, you would say the Ministry of Justice, you would say the Caizhenbu, the Ministry of Finance. I think if you're a senior Communist Party leader and look at the footage, you'll be very worried because in a dictatorship, everybody pretends to be loyal. And when you look at the accusations leveled at corrupt officials, one of them is that they are 两面人. These are the two-faced individuals. They pretend to be loyal, but actually are disloyal. So I don't know the percentage, but I think it's very fluid. That is, the question you really need to ask is, why are you loyal to the party? Today, I think most people stick with the party because the party gives them pretty good benefits. And that's a material reason. So once things are not, of course, it's also out of fear. So once things don't go that well, then they are not going to be loyal to the party. That's why the current campaign, the ideological campaign instituted by Xi Jinping, is to make sure that the party members are loyal. I think what the Communist Party has got is that party members pretend to be loyal. That's for sure. But are they really loyal? We really need a crisis to find out.
Okay, Liz.
Thanks. So I'll just make two quick points. So in thinking about, what do the Chinese people really want, or do we need to wait for the next generation to come up to have sort of a shift in thinking? I just look back. I look back to when, I was in China in the mid-1990s, doing the field research for my dissertation. And it was right at the time when Chinese civil society was blossoming and the environmental movement was taking off. Then I think up to like 2000, the late 2000s, 2009, 10, 11, you had these billionaires online with 50 million followers calling for, doing something on the environment or even political reform. You had them meeting in salons with intellectuals and others and, talking about political reform, all those lawyers, monthly dinner meetings that, Teng Biao will talk about. And I think, those people, they didn't change their minds from a decade ago to now. They're just being suppressed and repressed. It's not as though there isn't some kind of core group, that wouldn't like to see a different kind of Chinese, polity, right? They just can't express that right now. Or just think about what happened in the first month of COVID, when after Li Wenliang died, and you had, all those people on the Chinese internet saying, that they wanted freedom of speech, or those young people flocking to Wuhan and saying, we're going to actually find out what's going on. What's the truth behind all of this? Independent journalists and setting up websites to track, here's what the party is saying, the number of deaths, but here's what we're seeing outside the hospitals. I mean, to me, it's all still there, right? Mm-hmm. It's undercover. And so I don't think we should forget the degree to which, all these voices and people, to me, saying 60 to 80% of the party is somehow disaffected seems entirely reasonable. How many party members want to spend 4 to 5 hours a week looking at Xi Jinping's app, and having to say, this is what he's doing, and taking a quiz and turning it in? I can pretty much say 60 to 80% of people do not want to have to do that. So, for me, I think it's entirely reasonable, and we should keep our minds open to the fact that just because we can't see it right now, that kind of disaffection, isn't still present.
Great. Of course, on the extreme side of optimism or about the future, or if you will, pessimism about the future of the Chinese Communist Party, is Roger Garside's new book, China Coup, which literally predicts a kind of coup against the Xi regime. Andy, I think you have some thoughts on that, and then I'll give anyone else a chance to comment about it if they wish.
Yeah, first I want to comment on Liz's point. All of us on the panel are in universities, I guess. and the faculty are pervasively dissatisfied with everything, but the university will not be overthrown. Now, Garside predicts a coup that will be led by Li Keqiang and I forget which other member of the Politburo Standing Committee, because of a financial crisis that is imposed upon them by the CIA. I forget how the CIA does that. And Garside has Li Keqiang and this other guy, Wang Yang, I think, get together and say, we got to have a coup. Let's talk to some generals. I don't think so. You're all welcome to read this. He says it's a fictional, imagination in order to set up his analysis of all the problems that the regime faces, which I think we all agree on. I don't think a coup like that is possible. First of all, I think Xi has surrounded himself with real loyalists. Out of the 92 million party members, you might have 91 million, whatever the number is, 999, be dissatisfied. It doesn't matter, because all of the top few hundred or 20 or 30 people in the military, in the security agencies, in the Politburo are Xi Jinping's loyalists. They believe in him. They have believed in him in some cases since middle school. Even if that was not the case, the system surveils everybody. They're not allowed to have any secret conversations or secret phone calls or have a meeting of more than 3 people without permission. All of their secretaries and their security people report back to Xi Jinping. There's no way to carry out a coup. Without a coup, how is change going to happen?
Okay, it's a good question. I think that we'll put that aside and
Could
move
I
on
follow
now.
up on it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask Andy, these 20 to 30 to 40 that are super loyal, that are around Xi Jinping, how do you know if they're super loyal or, for obvious reasons, being very careful to appear super loyal?
I want to ask Min Shin, the head of the editor of the China Leadership Monitor, to answer that question. Basically, it's personal history.
Yeah, I think those who have worked with him are loyal. Then we don't know. I think Xi's problem in the next 10, 15 years is to find the second echelon, because he did not work with them directly. He had no way of knowing what kind of people they really are. And when you look at the problem Mao himself faced when he was close to death, that he did not know the people who were coming up, and he couldn't really count on them. So I think that's 15 years from now, Xi Jinping will have the same problem. It's not a loyalty or not. It's really a matter of knowledge and information.
You want to comment on that, Liz?
You know, I think it's possible that even if you have come up with someone and are initially, quote, loyal to them, that you can become disaffected from them because you see them turning into something that you don't like, right? And so, and that is how coups happen. You may be right, Andy, that it's very difficult for them to meet and to talk, but I would imagine that if the international backlash continues, right, and you have a lot of constraints, say Chinese companies like Huawei have increasing difficulties actually gaining access to major markets because of, party intrusion, right? Or, and you have, an alliance of democracies, which I can tell you on every Zoom call with Chinese colleagues, this is their biggest fear, right? Is that China is going to be facing an alliance of democracies because 9 of the 10, largest economies in the world are democracies. So if you start to have that, and then you also have those disaffected people that, yes, okay, well, university professors are particularly lame, and so you're not going to revolt, even though you're, enormously dissatisfied, right? But we have seen the Chinese people stand up, and we have seen 180,000 protests in 2010. So they do have the capacity when things get really bad, right, to sort of push back. And I could imagine, even though I know that Roger's book is a little fanciful, I could imagine a scenario where, performative legitimacy, is slowing because of some of the economic problems that Larry ticked off, and you have forces come together to say, if not Xi Jinping, you're out, at least something like what happened after the Great Leap Forward, and like Mao Zedong be moved to the second line, something along those lines where Xi Jinping becomes one among many as opposed to first among equals. So that's just, again, could be fanciful, but I don't think we should, eliminate this scenario.
If I can, I'd like to really drill down a bit now into the new era of digital monitoring of both elites, but of the entire society. Some people think, I think Chairman Xi would like to think, that this is really a game changer, that the CCP is building what others of us have called an Orwellian surveillance state, that may really be different than anything we've seen before, and may give it considerably greater immunity from a lot of the kind of sudden shocks or challenges that other such regimes have faced in a crisis. Others say, well, still you need, it's like the East German system depicted in Secrets and Lies, that famous movie. You still need people to operate the surveillance state. And if you lose their loyalty, the whole thing crumbles. Minchin, I won't ask you to preview the entire book you're writing, but we'll start off with you and ask to what extent will technology provide a safety net to save the party's hegemony if all else fails? Unmute,
Before
please.
the advent of technology, digital surveillance, China already had a very powerful, extensive, and effective surveillance state, mainly based on organization. This is where my research is. It's really impressive. My back of the envelope calculation is it employs millions of informers. It surveys about, it puts roughly about 1% of population as targets of surveillance. So the addition of digital technology certainly gives the Chinese government extra capability. But this system is not foolproof. If there were academic studies and based on my own research, there's always this window of vulnerability for the government. And we saw that at the beginning of the Wuhan outbreak, because it's a very top-down system. That is, the local censors wouldn't act unless they get clear instructions from the top. At the beginning of February last year, end of January, February, beginning of February last year, there were no clear instructions from the top. So the system did not function very effectively. So in other words, the system itself is not foolproof. And second, let's just put the system in the context. All surveillance systems stop function when the overall system does not work. I often joke that the Berlin Wall did not collapse because the Berlin secret police stopped working. If you check their attendance sheet, every one of them, I can bet, reported to work that day. And probably still kept files. It's, I think, when the party lost legitimacy, when the regime lost legitimacy. So if there should be such a situation when the performative legitimacy is gone, the party is completely demoralized, and on top of that, there is a succession crisis. The elites are divided. I would bet that surveillance system, however powerful it is in peacetime, would not actually work very well.
Interesting. Very interesting. A little bit more hopeful. Anybody else want to comment on that before I move on?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Minjin a question. What about the psychological effects on the populace when it knows that it's being surveilled? Eileen Zhang has a wonderful novel written in the early 50s about the takeover in the villages in China. And she traces someone who came from before 49 and has a wonderful sentence or a paragraph about he just wasn't used to the mood of being watched. And this upset him and he had to get used to it. So I like your analysis of how it really depends on the larger system, not just the mousetrap that the larger system uses. But when you grow up knowing that you are always watched, does that make a different kind of human being or a different kind of attitude?
I guess it works very well with most people, but there are always deviants. What is striking, because I'm using a lot of local data, that is every year, local police, we're talking about internet police, the domestic security protection police, they always report arresting people, finding people, following people, which means there's a small minority that defies, that behaves the same way, regardless of surveillance. One thing about revolution or resistance is that it doesn't take a lot of people to make a movement successful. Probably takes about 5% of people max, sometimes maybe even 1%. So, because it's all about making the fear disappear. So if 5% of the people dare to show their defiance, then the system is not working very well.
I don't want to run the risk of this session closing, which it will in 12 minutes, without each of you having a chance to reflect on the role of the U.S. and how we should think about and approach China in a way that would, let's say, facilitate and give space for or encourage positive changes away from the neo-totalitarian model. However you want to take that challenge, Liz, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. I mean, look, I think, it sounds trite, but I think actually the most important thing the United States can do is to get back to being a really good model. And, our divisiveness, the way we handle the pandemic, all of that, we need to heal ourselves both politically and then get back on track economically and demonstrate again, why we are a great, innovation nation. And I think that's probably the most powerful thing we can do to show that democracy works and it works really well. I think we have to remain open to Chinese students. I think that's incredibly important, and I'm optimistic that the Biden administration is going to do just that, and we'll get all the COVID vaccination things sorted out. I think that's essential. But I also think that it's important with this regime of Xi Jinping, and Andy sent me something in the chat saying that a democracy alliance could cause the opposite reaction in China, right? That I guess that can cause nationalism to spike, et cetera. It could have a deleterious effect. But I actually think it's really important with Xi Jinping to draw very bright lines, and it's because he is ambitious. And if you take a step back, look what happened when President Obama. He promised President Obama he wasn't going to militarize the artificial islands in the South China Sea, and the administration's like, okay, and then he went and did just that. So I think we have to be vigilant, and we have to draw bright lines, and so it's. I think we have to walk softly, talk softly, and carry a big stick, and be a good model.
Andy?
Well, it's a tough question. The Trump administration early on introduced this theme of strategic competition, and I think that it is the right theme. They also said a lot of other things that I thought were the wrong theme. Oh, excuse me. Why don't you go with somebody else till the phone stops ringing?
Okay. Perry, you want to go ahead, and then I'll come back to Andy.
I was on a webinar yesterday with Matt Pottinger, who of course was very active and consequential, I think, in the Trump regime. And somebody asked him this question, and his answer was candor. It's very important for the US government to be candid, by which he meant not playing word games that the CCP likes to get foreigners to play. And that struck me as right. That's what I try to do personally, I think, is try to tell the truth and do what's right and let the chips fall where they may. Of course, a government has to calculate where the chips are going to fall, but I wish our government and all of us could be just candid. That doesn't mean confrontational, but honest about how we see the world and our values in it. I have a lot of friends who are so-called Chinese dissidents, some of them who've been in prisons and labor camps, and I've yet to find one who says, no, shut up, don't rile them because it'll make it worse for us. Sometimes there are Americans who are afraid that that's going to happen. Nobody on the other side, in my experience, ever says that. The more you can speak up for them and speak up for what you see as the truth and what's best for China, the better.
Okay, back to you, Andy.
Okay, sorry about that. So I think, for example, when Mike Pompeo said at the Nixon Library at the end of the administration that he wants the Chinese people to overthrow the regime, I did send Liz a chat, and I think she didn't completely get the point of my chat, which was not about nationalism. It was about a sense of, it's a conviction in the leadership in China around Xi Jinping, among the strategic thinkers and the military and so forth, that the West wants to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party in order to keep China down. That's their conviction. I think that I agree with Perry that we need to support that change comes from within. It isn't going to be, it shouldn't be us, and it couldn't be us if we wanted it to be, that's going to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. Change comes from within. We should support those people. But it is useless and counterproductive for us to stand up and say, we want to, restrict the rise of China or overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, because they believe that. There's a long history behind it. It's not just Pompeo. And anybody in China who believes that the outside world is trying to keep China down is going to say, well, we don't want to be kept down. We are an important country. So I think getting the right way of supporting activists, Chinese activists, and not doing it in the wrong way would be my suggestion. And of course, I believe as a former board member that the NED does do it the right way.
Okay, let's go to the current board member, Min-Shin Pei.
Okay, I largely agree with Liz. That is, the U.S. has to maintain its own democracy. Let's just be very frank. Our democracy is under assault from within. If we cannot defend our democracy, then we will set a very poor example, not just for China, for everybody. The second issue that we need to keep cultural, educational exchange ties, try to insulate them from strategic security competition. And third is we need to be patient. This is not going, the US-China competition, whatever you call it, is going to be 2 or 3 decades into the future. So it will be not just our generation, next generation will see the outcome of it. So let's just be patient. Another thing is be very disciplined. Whatever you do, whatever you say, because you may gain some tactical momentary advantage, but it can cost you plenty. And here I want to bring in the issue of Chinese nationalism. The biggest obstacle for the US in the coming decades is Chinese nationalism. Because I think it's fine for Pompeo, people like him, to say, well, we try to separate Chinese people from the Chinese Communist Party. In China, they don't make that kind of distinction. Things you do that will undermine China, make life difficult for the Chinese Communist Party will inevitably hurt the Chinese people. So they are not going to, and if you do not have the right approach, you can actually strengthen the Communist Party's rule. Chinese nationalism is one of its sources of legitimacy. And finally, keep it a competition rather than a conflict. I think if you do not handle the policy well, then we're going to see a militarized competition, which is very, very dangerous.
We have just about 4 minutes left now. There were two other questions I wanted to get to. One is about Chinese overseas students, which many of you have briefly mentioned. And the other was about Chinese civil society, and that gets back to the work of the National Endowment for Democracy. Both of these could come under the basket if we take a resolute but patient approach of peaceful evolution, which the Chinese Communist Party seems to regard as a kind of dangerous challenge, if not epithet. So Andy, you're nodding your head. We'll start with you. What are the prospects for these two phenomenon within Chinese society to be agents of gradual change, or if one says peaceful evolution?
I'm sorry about that. Again, I'm going to throw this in the other room.
Don't worry about it. We're not hearing it.
Okay,
Yeah, we don't hear it.
Yeah,
We can't hear it.
My earlier pessimistic remarks about civil society, it's so under control. I agree with Liz that, you know, Chinese people are people. They're very individualistic and active and questing and all that thing, but the regime has it under control. And the youth come out for, I think the student exchange is so important, and they come out and they're curious. Many are curious, some are not. But I don't hold out hope for a bubbling up from below that's going to overthrow the party. And peaceful evolution absolutely is a slogan about the West wanting to see the demise of the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't think we should use that language. I think we should be using international human rights language, where the US is a bit of feet of sand because we ourselves have not signed many of the key conventions and often violate them.
Perry, is that the way you see it too?
I guess so. One of the language games that the CCP likes to play is to put out forbidden words that you're not supposed to use, like Cold War. That's bad. Whatever happens, we have to avoid that. Or regime change. And ever since George Bush invaded Iraq, we all feel we don't like that term. But again, Andy's right. We don't go make regime change. Absolutely not. But support people who want to. A lot of people in the dissident movement that have conferences and books on transition to democracy. The transition is a big word. Liu Xiaobo's one of his most famous essays, for which he was put away for 11 years, was to change a regime by changing society, which was the perk from the bottom up method. Learn to be nice to each other and it will perk upwards. He borrowed a lot of this from Václav Havel, who made it work in his view in Czechoslovakia. I'm finished.
Liz?
So you're making me end on a less optimistic note, because I do here once agree with Andy. I think the moment right now for civil society in China is not a great one. It's maybe the worst that I've encountered since I started doing my work in China, and so I'm not very optimistic about the prospects, and I don't see many ways, frankly, for US to engage in China with civil society. And I sit on the board of the Asia Foundation, and we are recognized there, and we do good work, but it's not the kind of work that we used to do on rule of law programs and other things. And so I think the engagement is so constrained right now that I don't see civil society in an organized form playing the same role that I would have seen it again back in the mid-1990s or in the late 2000s. I think this is just a fundamentally different moment, unfortunately. And also, I don't support using the terms peaceful evolution and things like that.
Okay, Minchin, we're going to give you the final words. If you see any grounds for long-term optimism, please articulate them.
Well, I do see long-term optimism because you see several crises in the making. There's a succession crisis, and this U.S.-China strategic competition, whatever you call it, is a very powerful force that is going to be a challenge for the Communist Party. You will also see this economic transition from this labor-intensive, manufacturing-based to a knowledge economy, and in tremendous socio-economic transformation within China. So all of these things will converge in about 15, 20 years. So that's this moment we can wait for, and I hope I will live long enough to see that moment. But in the interim, we have to be very realistic. We should not set our hopes too high. And whenever we meet people from China, students from China, I think we treat them as individuals, as human beings. We will help them as individuals. We don't want to give them this huge historic burden of changing China. We want to help them succeed academically, professionally. That's what we can do. If they know more about China, if they gain some values that we identify with, that's a bonus.
Well, it seems like that's what we did with a young Harvard PhD student in the Department of Government named Min-Shin Pei, and it worked out pretty well, at least for China studies in the United States. I think that's very sage advice, and I'd like to thank all four of you, Perry Link, Min-Shin Pei, Liz Economy, and Andy Nathan, for an extraordinarily rich and insightful discussion, and hearty thanks to Carl Gershman and the National Endowment for Democracy for sponsoring this discussion and for all the work it has done to try and support and nurture democracy in China. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Larry.